Alright, buckle up because we're heading to Morristown, New Jersey, where the Continental Army is about to face one of the most brutal winters of the American Revolution. You've heard of Valley Forge, right? Yeah, this winter at Morristown makes Valley Forge look like a tropical vacation. Let's dig into the story of December 1779, where General George Washington and his soldiers set up camp, if you can call it that, in the freezing hills of New Jersey, all while trying to keep the revolution from freezing over along with them. So picture this, Washington and his troops roll into Morristown in December of 1779. They're thinking, hey, we survived Valley Forge. How bad can it get? Spoiler alert, it's bad. Morristown becomes the coldest place imaginable, like the North Pole decided to stop by, and Washington's army has no idea what they're in for. Snow, check. Ice, check. Not enough food? Triple check. Morristown's winter? Unmatched. Now you might be asking, why Morristown? Why not someplace warmer? It turns out that Morristown was strategically a pretty solid choice. It's high in the hills, offering a defensible location where they could see British troops coming from miles away. Plus, it's close enough to New York to keep an eye on the Redcoats, but far enough to avoid surprise attacks. And most importantly, it's near supplies. Or well, it's supposed to be near supplies, but we'll get to that disaster soon. So Washington's army arrives, and they get to work building log cabins, about 1,000 of them. Each cabin is crammed with about a dozen soldiers. Imagine sharing a log cabin with a dozen people. Barely any food, and temperatures dropping below freezing every night. Sounds cozy, right? Wrong. With each passing day, it's like nature decides to one-up itself, going from cold to Arctic tundra to welcome to the Ice Age. The snow piled up to 6 feet high at one point, trapping the troops in their own camp. Getting firewood became a whole operation, where soldiers would trudge through waist-deep snow for miles just to bring back a few logs to keep warm. And food? Well, if you thought Valley Forge's rations were bad, Morristown took things to a new level. Soldiers were surviving on a mix of old bread, scraps of meat, and whatever they could scavenge. Now, you'd think that the Continental Congress would have learned their lesson from Valley Forge and started sending better supplies, right? Well, not so much. It was like Congress was in their own world, far away from the suffering of the soldiers, sending nothing but the occasional pep talk. Morristown was not just cold, it was a battleground of survival. Desperation crept in, and Washington's soldiers were on the edge of revolt. They were cold, hungry, and sick of being told to hang in there. Washington had to pull off a balancing act, keeping his troops from abandoning camp while begging for supplies from a Congress that was running out of funds. Morale hit an all-time low, with soldiers actually talking about ditching the camp and going home. Desertion became a real problem, and you couldn't really blame them. One soldier was quoted as saying, "If Congress doesn't care if we freeze, then why should we?" Now, if you thought George Washington was just a general, think again. This guy had to be a counselor, a negotiator, and a miracle worker. At Morristown, he probably gave more motivational speeches than a life coach. Every day he was out there talking to his men, showing them he was suffering right along with them. Washington's whole reputation was riding on keeping these men together through the worst winter yet. At one point, Washington sent out his aides to beg the local population for food and blankets, literally going door to door in New Jersey. Think about that. America's future was saved by Washington's aides practically holding bake sales and blanket drives. It was a real grassroots operation, the kind of desperate stuff they don't put on recruitment posters. Washington even dipped into his own funds to pay for food to keep morale up, proving he was willing to give it all to keep this army alive. Finally, as winter dragged on and the soldiers were just about to give up all hope, they started to receive a trickle of supplies. Blankets, a bit of food, and yes, actual uniforms. And right in time too, because those uniforms, they were falling apart after months of brutal conditions. The men had been using the same clothes for so long that threadbare became a generous description. Slowly, the mood in camp improved. They were still cold, but they were starting to feel a spark of hope. Washington's leadership was like a lifeline for the men, showing them that they were in this together. Despite the brutal winter, despite the lack of supplies, and despite the constant threat of starvation, the men began to dig in their heels and commit to seeing the revolution through. By the time spring finally rolled around, the Continental Army at Morristown had survived what was arguably the harshest winter they would ever face. They'd lost men, yes, and morale had been low, but they made it. And the fact that they had endured such harsh conditions without breaking apart became a badge of honor. These were no longer just soldiers. They were survivors, bonded by a brutal winter that had tested every one of them. Washington knew that if his men could survive Morristown, they could survive anything. This winter set the stage for the last leg of the Revolutionary War, giving the Continental Army a core group of hardened, dedicated fighters who believed in Washington and believed in the cause. The winter at Morristown might not have the fame of Valley Forge, but it's where the Continental Army truly became resilient. They'd faced starvation, freezing temperatures, and even the temptation to desert, but they'd held together. Washington's leadership had been the glue, his determination and belief in the cause keeping the army intact. Morristown became more than a winter camp. It became a symbol of endurance, a testament to the spirit that would ultimately drive the Americans to victory. So the next time you hear someone say, "It's cold outside," just remember, Washington and his troops braved Morristown with little more than grit, frozen toes, and a dream of independence. And that, folks, is how the Continental Army survived one of the coldest winters in American history, with Washington at the helm, guiding them through a snowstorm of challenges.